join with the device.
Okay, so we.
Zato što te pita da se priključiš.
The image went off. Bojan, the image went off.
Samo to je bila promena.
I don't know if we are still being seen. Can you hear us well?
Webex.
Okay.
Yes.
Now we are.
Ne, ja sam izbačena.
Okay, just a question. For the people online, can you hear us well?
Nismo online, sve nas je izbacilo.
Evo, ja sam ponovno ušla.
Jesi išla? Ovo join me, guys.
Okay, thank you very much for the confirmation. I think that there is some echo going on. Fantastic. Okay, well, welcome to this session of the Belgrade's Legal Theory Group. This new meeting, we have in this session Marco Segatti. Marco Segatti holds degrees in law from the University of Pavia and the bachelor's, the University of Bologna, a PhD, and then he went to the United States to do a LLM in Harvard. And then it's a JSD, I think.
JSD, yes.
JSD in the University of Chicago Law School. His research interests lie at the intersection of political philosophy, legal theory, the epistemology of social sciences, and comparative procedural law. He's currently preparing a monograph with Springer on equal access to justice. And in this meeting, he's going to give a lecture or give a talk about the problems with Hart's habits, a Humean account of social obligation. So welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you, Julieta. Thank you, Bojan. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a great honor to be here, presenting my ideas. This is a project I've been working on for quite some time, but I haven't really presented it yet publicly. So I'm curious to pick your brains on how to improve it and whether you like it or not, generally. So I have a paper too. I'm not sure whether you all have it, but if you're interested, I can share it. So do ask. All right. So we all know that Herbert Hart demolished Austin's theory of law as command in chapter 4 of the concept of law. But do we really know that? And in my presentation today, I will try and make the case that we actually do not know that on account of Hart's kind of simplistic rendering of human habits, which is one central conceptual piece in Austin's theory of law generally. So Hart assumes that the central characteristic of human habits is repetition, a mere external or a mechanic phenomenon of thoughtless human behavior. Consequently, claims, habit and threats theory, like Austin's, cannot first distinguish between merely social convergent and repetitive behavior on one side and behavior compliant with a social rule on the other. I will call this the efficacy challenge. Second, Hart argues that a habits and threats theory reduces the internal aspect of an obligation to a mere feeling of compulsion. I will call this the compulsion challenge. Consequently, and third, Hart might have believed that Austin's theory cannot account for the so-called normative force of a social rule. I call this the normativity challenge. Now, I will begin by reviewing these three arguments against the habit and threats theory of social obligation and show how they point to a structural deficiency of a canonical interpretation of a Humean conception of human conduct, which is arguably the theoretical tradition which directly influenced Austin's own conception. Then I propose an alternative conception of human habits built on redefinitions of human habits themselves and pleasure. Next, I build definitions of rules in general and social rules in particular out of such alternative conception. And finally, I try to show how this reconstruction can successfully meet Hart's challenges to a habits and threat theory of social obligation. I will conclude by speculating on some possible lessons for contemporary philosophical thought on the law from this intellectual history. Final premise, I will not say much, almost nothing at all, on the actual intellectual origins of my redefinition. In the paper, which is this presentation is based on, I try to make the case that this conception of habit is really not so far removed from Hume's original conception. This explains the subtitle. More broadly, I found traces and important antecedents of this conception of human habits in several other authors, and I draw inspiration from them, who, by the way, disagree on important details of their respective conceptions of human habits and actually agree on very little else, from John Stuart Mill to John Dewey, from John Rawls to Elizabeth Anderson, Agnes Callard, and possibly Gary Becker too, an economist, from Marco Brigaglia and Bruno Celano to legal philosopher, to Daniel Kahneman, who is a social psychologist, Michel Foucault, another philosophy, and Pierre Bourdieu, sociologist and philosopher. So I will bracket these intellectual origins and sources of inspiration for my own ideas for the purposes of my presentation. And there isn't much about this even in the paper, but please do ask if you're interested and want to know exactly what I borrow from them and what I do not. All right, so let us begin then with our challenges to habits and threat theory. I bonded there. No. Relay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So now there are certainly several hundreds different ways of reconstructing Hart's arguments in chapter 4 of the concept of law. For my purposes, it is helpful to begin by drawing a few connections between Hart's argument in chapter 4 and his later arguments in chapter 7 of the concept of law against so-called predictive theories of legal obligation. So what's a predictive theory of legal obligation according to Hart's definition in chapter 7? A predictive theory of legal obligation is one according to which the statement, I have an obligation to do X, means the judge will sanction me with S if I do Y instead of X. One of Hart's arguments in chapter 7, one of Hart's most famous argument in chapter 7, is that this predictive and verificationist conception of legal obligation doesn't reflect ordinary meaning and use at all. Why? Because we often say we have an obligation, even when we can't, or before we can, reasonably expect a sanction in case of noncompliance. That is, this predictive and verificationist definition collapses the existence of a legal obligation, circumstances C1 and C2, which make I have an obligation to do X true, and one aspect of its efficacy, namely the fact that the justice system does a fairly good job in responding to violation with predictable legal consequences. And habits, even in the limited sense of thoughtless repetition of past activity, and Hart's pointer in chapter 7 of the concept of law loses some, not all, some of its bite. Sure, we can meaningfully say, I have an obligation to do X, but I'm not going to do it since no one will catch me. Or sometimes we comply with a social rule even when we don't know or don't care if someone will catch us if we don't. But habits can square this linguistic and behavioral phenomena with a predictive theory with relative ease. Sometimes we comply with a social rule, or we don't, because we have become habituated to compliance by threats and actual sanctions to ourselves or to others. These habits are not themselves necessarily thoughtless or unintelligent because they're often the result of social adjustments to stable circumstances. But once habituated, we follow through thoughtlessly and without always adjusting our behavior to any new piece of information on expected sanction, or even partially or completely unaware of what we're doing and why on earth we keep doing it. So a habits and threats theory can account for the existence of a social obligation. For example, in social group A, there is a shared social habit of doing X in C1 and C2, and this social habit was formed by habituation to threats and actual punishments, and distinguished this definition of the existence of a social rule from its judicial efficacy. The justice system predictably punishes most wrongdoings according to the threats issued. These two statements describe different things. All the while, this habits and threat theory can consider itself a predictive and verificationist theory. Knowing the law or social rules more generally is still just about being able to make smart bets on observable social behavior. But I have an obligation to do X in C1 and C2 means in my social group, there is a shared habit of doing X in C1 and C2. And this habit was formed by habituation to threats and actual punishments, which are, arguably at least, still statements expressed in predictive and observational language. But this is the point where chapter 4 goes to work in this reconstruction. Relatively thoughtless habits, compulsions, and strategic behavior may well account for a lot, to be sure. But this is not even nearly enough, because we're still missing an account of the peculiar attitude of involved attachment of one subject, taking up an internal perspective on a social rule. We're still failing, that is, the second part of the efficiency challenge. Also, if we confuse habits with social rules, we might mistake the internal aspect of rules with mere feelings of compulsions, which means we are failing the compulsion challenge too. Finally, the normativity challenge, where something to be a rule and not a mere habit, says Hart, quote, not only is criticism in fact made, but deviation from the standard is generally accepted as a good reason for making it, end quote. All right, so it is important now, I think, for my purposes to know. I pressed it too hard. Okay. To see how Hart's argument in chapter 4 easily generalized to a canonical interpretation of Hume's account of human agency and motivation and point to one of its structural deficiencies. Now, I say quite a bit in the paper about Hume and his conception of human conduct, but here's an extremely cursory and, as I say in the paper, possibly wrong summary. So Hume takes passions to be, in this canonical interpretation of Hume, I don't think this is the real Hume, but bracket that. Hume takes passions to be the principal basis of human choice. We all know that. These passions are the result of interactions between past sensations of pleasure and pain and beliefs about their causal connections, what caused these sensations in the past and what can cause them now or in the future. In their prototypical form, passions display a direct relation between beliefs and sensations of pleasure and pain. It is the object of any passion in its prototypical form. Its end is a future sensation of pleasure or pain, the natural reward for its accomplishment. Passion explain choice because they explain to which things or doings or beings the agent has attached pleasure as a reward, either by their own doings and prior experiences, either endogenously, or through implanted instincts, impulses in a more modern vocabulary, that is, exogenously, something built up in the biology of a human being. Now, one problem of this characterization is that it assumes that want experiences, what it is that the agent wants, and experiences at the moment of deliberation and explain choice, and like experiences, what it is that the agent experiences at the terminal point of their behavioral strategies, generally converge in human behavior because it takes the pursuit of pleasure as the sole object of choice. People generally want to do what they expect will give them most pleasure once accomplished. And this is where a Humean conception of human behavior falls right into Hart's trap in chapter 4. Assume that want and like converge in human behavior, and all you're left with to explain commitments to social rules are strategic behavior, compulsions, and thoughtless habits. When choice collapses wants and likes through pleasure, we are at odds to explain how any activity at all can be voluntary and not concerned with one's own pleasure as well. And we are at odds to explain how choice governed by social rules can be more than merely strategic behavior, thoughtless routine, or a form of compulsion. Now, let's see what happens when we introduce my redefinitions. So, habits, in my definition, are a bundle of impulses, expectations, abilities, that is, skills, and environmental variables, including one's social capital. I can define that a bit better, which reduce the relative marginal cost of cognitive awareness and motivational control over one activity or another. They define marginal rates of substitution between activities in the present and marginal rates of substitution between activity in the past, present, and future. These are called time preferences, basically. So habits are more than repetitive behavior. They are acquired predispositions to act in specific ways and incorporate both static judgments on comparing different present activity, as well as dynamic judgments on the effects of present and past choices on future inclinations, and thus choices as well. They are ways of valuing, which may or may not be flexible and responsive to changes in the environment, depending on the abilities of the agents, their expectation, and their abilities to adjust both to these changes. Pleasure or utility, in my redefinition, Hume's pleasure is not the sole object of choice, a like experience, that is, an experience at the terminal point of activity and which motivates it as a reward. Pleasure is a want experience, and only that, an experience at the moment of choice and which pushes it forward. Whenever Hume writes pleasure, or utilitarians or economists write utility, read stimulation. A rule is the name of a habit. That is, a rule is the name of a bundle of impulses, skills, expectations, and environmental variables, including one's social capital. And a social rule, as opposed to an idiosyncratic one, is the name of a habit which includes expectations about the effects of one's choices over one's social capital. So a person who possesses such a habit, which accepts then a social rule, incorporates marginal rates of substitution between different activities and marginal rates of substitution between past, present, and future activities as well. Such person, if the habit they possess represents a social rule, is responsive to expectations about the effects of their choices and activities on the choices and habits of other people, and thus their propensities toward them. A rule exists, then, when we can give a name to a habit, either real or imaginary, and use its valuations as standards of behavior. An effective rule is one whose existence reduces the relative marginal cost of cognitive awareness and motivational control over one activity or other. Or a rule is effective for one person whenever that person possesses the relevant habit, which means that rules in general, and social rules particularly, can be shared or not within a social group, depending on whether its members share or not the relevant habit. And there are two general ways of making a rule effective. That is, there are two ways in which the existence of a rule generally may reduce the relative marginal cost of cognitive awareness and motivational control over one activity or other. A rule may reduce the relative marginal cost of cognitive awareness and motivational control over one activity by increasing the marginal cost of all other activities. So I will call this a compulsion. After a while, the agent must perform the activity again because the cognitive and motivational marginal cost of doing anything else is just too dear, right? I can't think of anything else but doing the object of my compulsion. Or a rule may decrease the relative marginal cost of one activity directly without increasing the marginal costs of other activities. I will call this a commitment. The activity is performed because it comes out easy, naturally and automatically, and the agent can exert control on its development with smaller marginal costs. It's easy to do. It's the easiest thing to do, not because all other activities are so dear, but because the activity itself, through an increase in skills, perhaps, it's more natural. So these are all definitions. Of course, they all have a history, and we can get into that in the Q&A, and all points track specific concepts which are not original to my paper, not at all. But let's see, when we apply this new framework, the general idea of applying these definitions to Hart's challenges. So let's begin with the efficacy challenge. The first part of this challenge demands that we distinguish between the existence of a social rule and its judicial efficacy. A rule may exist even when we cannot plausibly predict a sanction in case of violation of the rule itself. And we have seen now how the received interpretation of a habits and threats theory conception provides at least the beginning of an answer to this particular challenge. Rule compliance can be just about as habituation and thoughtless repetition as about smart adjustments to expectations. But now we can add something more general or radical. If a social rule is a name of a habit, then it is the name of one possible cause of overt behavior. As we have said, habits causally influence overt conduct by reducing the marginal cost of cognitive awareness and motivational control. And causes cannot be analytically correlated with their effects, making any attempt at reducing social rules to overt behavior a vacuous goal. But habits causally influence overt behavior because they incorporate human evaluations too. So social rule is a name of a possible cause of overt behavior, and as such, of a way of incorporating valuations within one's acquired predispositions to act. Furthermore, following a social rules implies the development of habits which include expectations about the consequences of one's behavior on other people's propensities toward oneself, which means that the agents now sees their behavior as part of a more general one and use this more general behavior as a standard for their own behavior as well. These remarks deal with the second part of the efficacy problem. The existence of a social rule is the existence of a name of incorporating valuations within one's predispositions to act, and which include expectations about the effects of one's choices on the predisposition, the habit that is, of relevant others. Social rule is thus more than merely convergent behavior and thoughtless repetitions, partly because it is the name of one possible cause of such convergence, and partly because the efficacy of this cause depends on the acquisition and efficacy of a standard for social criticism. Second challenge, the compulsion challenge, demands that we make room for more than compulsions in the explanation of the internalization of social rules. This is precisely what the distinction between compulsions and commitment does. Compulsions reduce the relative marginal cost of cognitive awareness and motivational control of performing one activity over another by increasing the marginal cost of all others. Commitments do the opposite. They reduce the relative marginal cost of the first one by directly reducing it through an increase in the skills, maybe. But what about the normativity challenge? I said I only have a decent answer. Well, I actually say it in the paper, so I'll begin slowly and in the negative. The first contribution is that my redefinitions prevent hedonist utilitarians from using Hume to make a bad political argument. The fact that wants are understood to converge with likes, while the latter are reduced to pleasure, might appear like a vindication of the principle of hedonic utility as an interpretation of justice. Why should public policy aim at maximizing pleasure or, hedonic utility? Well, because that's what everyone wants and likes. Anyways, of course, at least since the beginning of the 20th century, many philosophers have been persuaded that powerful arguments by Moore have effectively demolished Mill's much more sophisticated version of this argument, connecting justice to utility by connecting wants to likes. It is, I think, very instructive to notice, however, that Mill had plenty to say on cases in which wants do not appear to converge on likes. And you won't be surprised now by his examples, his own examples either: compulsions, habits, and virtuous action. Bracket all this, that is Moore's anti-naturalism against Mill, and what's key is that my alternative definition of pleasure and utility effectively blocks this utilitarian strategy right from the start. By severing the connection between wants and likes, my definition breaks open the simple way of connecting justice and utility too. So the first contribution of this framework is that we're not authorized, without further and penetrating arguments, to infer any advice on reasonable choice from the mere fact that we are observing that utility, stimulation, in my definition, is going up or down. The second contribution strikes a more positive note. To see it, think of this very plausible objection to what has been said so far, about commitments especially. Now, the characterization of social norms as names of habits of a certain type fails to account for one very common intuition, namely the intuition that compliance with a social obligation often requires sacrifice, something one wouldn't do were it not for the obligation itself. So, but how can habits then represent this phenomenology of sacrifice if they reduce the relative marginal cost of cognitive awareness and motivational control over activity? They make activity easier, more natural, and decidedly less difficult. So when we accept the social rule, the feeling should not be of sacrifice. This becomes more natural. Well, two strategies available here. One is to say, most generally, that severing wants from likes implies that easier action doesn't mean more expected net pleasure as a result. That is, nothing in this formal representation of habits prevents one from believing that people can be stimulated to sacrifice themselves for the sake of someone or something else, and with no hope of any personal return. So activity is easier, but you're going for, some hardship. Reduction of the relative marginal cost of cognitive awareness and motivational control simply means that the activity stimulates the agent relatively more. The second strategy is to interpret this phenomenology of sacrifice within a very specific moment in the deliberative life of human agents, situations in which an agent perceives uncertainty in present stimulation, doesn't know what to do, and must act now with a view of resolving the uncertainty and possibly changing their or other people's future habits too. Notice that this is still a very, prudential view of human agency. It's all prudent. One decides what to do by considering the likely future consequences of their choices. But it is a very special kind of prudence, however. First, because relevant consequences include the effects of present choice on one's and other people's future habits as well. And second, because the causal imputation of effects shouldn't stop at actions, but rather recede to choices as well. Third, and consequently, because the agent chooses a proximate goal, finding out the consequences of present choice, with a more remote goal in view, using such discovery as a means to reform one's own or other people's habits. The result is that action directed at changing one's own or other people's habits may be able to represent part of this phenomenology of sacrifices as a peculiar form of investment in one's own or other people's habits. The agent accepts costs now, the sacrifice that we feel that we are making by complying to a social obligation, to reform habits and thus choices and activity in the future. All right. So I will stop with a few general remarks on what I take to be the philosophical lesson of all this. So the big question is, was Hart wrong in attacking a habit and threats conception of social obligation? It depends. If you read Hart's argument in chapter 4 as a refutation of an entire Humean, utilitarian, and I would say pragmatist tradition of interpreting social obligation, yes, because there are visible and almost ready at use conceptual and theoretical resources within Hart's and Austin's own tradition, which allow for a finer definition of human habits. But does this amount to a refutation of Hart's argument against the habits and threats theory of legal obligation? No. For one thing, my paper doesn't propose a complete account of social obligations and much less a full theory of legal orders and institutions. To make these next and huge steps, we would still be missing several connected but a long list of details. We can go into them if you're interested. Furthermore, nothing here is meant to refute Hart's claim, and this is the central claim that I take to be central claim in chapter 4, that social rules, legal ones included, are more than mere compulsions and repetitive behavior. In fact, my paper and my presentation today merely adds that we can understand habits, human habits, to be more than these things too. So when we come to see that, the paper further infers, we have a rich, albeit incomplete, model for studying social obligations generally, and perhaps legal ones specifically, in the wild. More implicit, but we also have a message of hope for the art-nosed realist. You do not have to reduce all human attachments to either pleasure-seeking strategic behavior, compulsions, or thoughtless habituation, even if you want an empiricist conception of social obligation, save when such reductions actually provide better explanations of social behavior, better empirical explanations of social behavior. Finally, consider the normativity challenge once again. As we have seen, Hart might have argued, there is debate whether he actually thought that, but let's assume he did, that a theory of legal obligation must explain law's normativity. And a kind of when, that is, law's authority binds its subject. And I said, I merely have a decent reply here and not a full reply. And this is a very brief recapitulation of why. The major advantage of this conception, my conception of habits and human motivation, is that it seems compatible with a host of different normative approaches. Most visibly, my redefinitions do not easily collapse into any form of hedonist utilitarianism. Pleasure is still all important in this approach, to be sure, but not as the sole object of choice. It is stimulation. And that's good news too. It means the vocabulary proposed here can be shared by different and perhaps otherwise incompatible moral and political traditions. If you think that legal and political theory should help people reduce the risk of talking past each other in legal and political discussions, then perhaps you agree that a shared theoretical vocabulary is an asset, albeit a clearly incomplete one. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. You were perfectly within the half an hour.
Really?
Absolutely, like
Perhaps I talked too fast.
30 minutes and 14 seconds. So thank you very much for this. Now, yeah. Okay, now the floor is open for questions. Who wants to start the gladiator show? Yeah, Sava.
Thank you for the great presentation. I have probably two clarificatory questions regarding your conclusion. Is my understanding right that the consequences of this assessment and the conclusion are of a conceptually modest nature, meaning that your redefinition of habits would now encompass Hart's internal perspective, meaning that it doesn't undermine the conclusions that Hart drew within the theory. It just makes a redefinition of what habits do mean.
Yeah.
And that it doesn't go further than that, meaning in the conceptual part. That's one, and the second would be, when you talk of a social rule, is it necessary for the assessment to be focused on the rule of recognition only, or does it encompass something more, and perhaps does it involve actually the primary rules? Because in my understanding of Hart, the normativity of the primary rules is derived from the rule of recognition. So would that change the conclusion if we were to say that the social rule goes beyond the rule of recognition, perhaps includes a bit more? I'm not certain if that would change something.
To answer?
Yes.
Yeah. The first question, yes. I don't. These three arguments are. I think they are the most successful arguments in the history of legal philosophy in the 20th century. I mean, arguably, everybody accepts them, right? I mean, even people, Dworkin is obviously not very much of a Hartian, but he accepts these three challenges. And in fact, he raises them against Hart himself, right? That he doesn't solve them properly. So I wouldn't want to go against that. So perhaps I'm not, again, with the normativity, for example, I'm not sure that that's a task for legal philosophy, quite frankly. I mean, it is a task for political philosophy, definitely. And I'm not big on, defining boundaries, fixed boundaries between disciplines. So I wouldn't push the point there. But yeah, I mean, that's my only disagreement, I guess. But we need to have an answer to these challenges, even if we don't then agree that these are the challenges that should define our search for a theory of law, which may not be true, right? So but these are certainly necessary desiderata of any theory of law, that they answer these challenges. And just to insist on this point, I guess my objective is to say something like, all right, so if you buy Hart's argument in chapter 4, and I think you should buy it, then you don't have to go, and I'm not sure how frequent this inference is taken, but you don't have to go hermeneutic in order to buy that challenge. That's the point I want to make. I mean, you don't have to reject an entire tradition which is on somewhat a different camp than the hermeneutic tradition, whatever that means. It could mean a whole lot of different things. Why? Because you have in that tradition a tradition of conceiving human habits, has something a lot more than mere repetition of past behavior. I mean, repetition of past behavior is an essential feature of human habits, definitely, but it's a feature within a larger context. And this is not, I mean, the definition is mine, but, and I am hesitant to, attribute it directly to any author, because then somebody comes and actually didn't say that. I agree, didn't say that. But I think it's already in Hume. It's already in Mill, basically. I mean, I'm not sure about Bentham. Bentham has so many stuff written, and I don't know it all. So I never found a very, systematic discussion of habits, but there could be. But, I would go as far as saying that, we shouldn't call them utilitarians, these guys. We should call them, I don't know, habituarians, or, something like that. Yeah, no, because habits is, like utility, the central concept of the tradition. And once you have that, then you don't have to buy the old hermeneutic interpretation of Hart. Whatever that means, which is a big discussion, and I don't want to disparage it. It's just that, there are ways of meeting that challenge. The second question is tougher. And you're perfectly right. And it's not in the paper, but I should add it. And thank you for pointing this out, because yeah, the normativity of primary rules is derived in Hart from the normativity of the rule of recognition, at least partly. So I'm talking about, and I make it seem as though this is the normativity of primary rules that we're talking about. And I'm talking about the normativity of primary rules. Partly because the rule of recognition hasn't appeared yet in chapter 4. That goes in the solutions column of Hart. So yeah, I mean, I do something in the footnotes of the paper about not definitions of the rule of recognition, but about definition of secondary rules. And I think that my definition of habits can incorporate definitions of secondary rules, I think.
See why not.
So, and I have a definition of, I wouldn't want to discuss, but yeah. So, yeah, I have to think about that. But, I have ideas on it. I wouldn't want to put my foot down as I present the paper, because I wanted the paper to be very small. I already submitted to a very prestigious journal. It didn't receive very good reviews, I'm afraid to say. But one was, this is just a smart rearrangement of pieces of intellectual furniture, which was very fine for me. I mean, that's exactly what I want to do. It's just, just play with just pieces of intellectual furniture and enlarge them. It's not a theory of law. So I do believe, and I haven't found a way to express it in the paper in a way that wouldn't confuse the reader. I do believe that we take it from here, then we can go much higher and in more abstract directions. I don't want to do it in the paper. Otherwise, it's a book. I mean, it's not even a book. It's a 10-volume treatise. I don't know. So this is a 10,000 words paper, and it's just it. And the takeaway, I think, is just that.
Yeah.
What you said precisely. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well,
It's
boys,
a nice rejection of the line of, I have to remember this for the reviews. That was a beautiful rearrangement of intellectual terms.
Not beautiful. Not beautiful.
Yeah,
Because
be more.
that I would have taken it more. I don't want it to be beautiful. I don't care about. I mean, that theory should be beautiful and all of that. But it said smart. I couldn't. And the rejection was, quite
it's like
total,
backhanded
right?
compliment.
And that was, yeah. I mean, I was
Like,
Put that in the
no,
abstract.
but
Yeah.
just moving the chair from here to there.
yeah. But isn't that what we do?
I know. It's like,
Yeah.
no,
So that. That's it.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know how social rules are formed. I mean, I shouldn't have a theory. I mean, a philosophical theory on that. I mean, I should have the conceptual furniture in place for somebody else. I mean, if you want to do it yourself, then do it. But then you have to do something different, not just sit on your laptop and write or read. You have to go out in the world and get the seat of your pants dirty.
Can I jump in since I already,
if it's a
didn't
follow-up.
provide you to- So isn't there a difference between a sofa and a chair, in a sense?
Excuse me.
In a sense, whether there is a difference between habit and a custom?
Uh-huh.
Because you haven't mentioned customs specifically, and this is the kind of very traditional way to start the kind of the conceptual distinction, including these two elements, like external, internal. So I can see that your definition includes some internal psychological elements, like in order to interiorize something, obviously,
Yeah.
there have to be a psychological process. But
Yeah.
then, is there any room for a distinction between a habit and a custom?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I should do something about this. It was in the back of my mind, but I never, nobody has ever pushed me. So, custom is a very difficult thing. And, is the common law customary?
Usually we say so.
I
We teach students that we so.
Yeah, so I think with these sort of the fundamentals of this definition of habits, which, by the way, this is all integrated within, I wouldn't say standard, not exactly 101, but 102 perhaps, contemporary microeconomics. I mean, this is stuff, I'm not a microeconomist, not at all. I'm not at the frontier of the researcher doing stuff which is far more difficult than this. But this is just elements that are there. And it's just picking up the fundamentals, sort of the most important elements that are relevant, I think, for philosophically analysis of law and legal analysis in particular. And I think that with these things, I haven't mentioned a word which is a crucial idea, but it's sort of implied, which is intertemporal complementarities. The fact that what we do in the past has an influence on our inclination now, right? So the stock of past experiences should enter into our utility functions, roughly speaking. Now, that idea already, I'm getting too long to habits and custom. I think it's very useful for interpreting, for example, judicial precedents. So with this definition of habits, then perhaps you may have a model for interpreting how precedents binds and evolve through time. So that would be a piece, a way of beginning the connection between habit and custom in a more technical legal sense. I don't know much more than that, but yes, I mean, once the confusion is that for that, you have to have a theory of how these are formed, right? I mean, one way, I guess, to understand the distinction between, a rule and, a non-customary rule and a customary rule is in the way in which it was formed, it came to be, how it was created, right? So a customary rule is created through practice, whereas a non-customary rule is created through an enactment of some sort. So I wanna use the definition of habit to apply to both. So I don't want to be too specific on the genesis of how the rule came up to be. I want to give out the elements to then study them. So I would still, in short, I really don't know. And I would see it as different. I would want to see it as different because I would want to use this conception of human habits to study legal customs, including, for example, one very specific and one very peculiar one, which is the practice of judicial transfer. But it's a different project, though. I see the point, and I definitely I should add a footnote, trying to be more synthetic and to the point, answering the questions that you posed. I mean, I see it as relevant.
Let me give you one example. My wife, I hope she will forgive me for taking this public.
On record, yes.
Yeah, so.
For the whole world. I guess. Yeah.
So she does one thing. She has this practice before bed. She brushes her teeth. She turns on the water. She uses the water as we all do, and then she turns off the water before the last spit in the what's the
Yeah, in the sink.
yeah. So
Yeah.
that's obviously annoys me.
Yeah.
But that's a totally habitual behavior.
Yeah.
So I don't see any possibility of turning this habitual behavior into a rule. And you want to encompass habitual behavior into a rule under certain addendums of your conceptual frameworks. And I can see literally no way
Okay.
through
Yeah.
to turn this habit into a rule in any meaningful sense of the word.
All right. So, yeah, you're right. Well, what it is.
It is a bad habit, definitely.
Yeah. So,
Would you want to follow up before?
Yes, yeah.
He wants to follow up.
I'm afraid, Marco, that I won't make things easier because I wanted to do a similar thing, but just turn it on its head.
okay.
In the following sense, I find your analysis of habits extremely compelling. I actually agree with it, even without the economical, let's say, mumbo jumbo. It's basically a pragmatic account of habits. You could read it, for example, in people ever since at least William James.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they have this account of habits, or pragmatists usually have this account of habits that reject this idea of mindless repetitive behavior, which is kind of annoying and not really true. So this obviously strikes something that is true, even without calculations or explanations with utility functions and so on. I mean, they were doing it by using some psychological explanations of reflex arc and novel stimuli and the reactions to stimuli, so you eventually reach a point where you internalize behavior as habitual behavior, but based on the initial reflexive attitude towards a behavior and towards an old situation. Basically, you're just repeating the solution to a problem, so it becomes a habitual behavior, which is kind of just being told in a different way, kind of the same thing, on a level that might not be utility maximizing level or utility optimization level. But this is kind of the question that, and this is why I think it's ultimately, when it comes to social rules, an analysis of habits might be important, but when it comes to the efficacy of rules, as a way of meeting the challenge of efficacy of rules, but when it comes to explaining this normativity of, or the third challenge, the normativity of rules, I'm not sure that it does the work. And for me, it's usually as simple as, can there be social rules without habitual behavior in accordance with those rules? And I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
There can be a social rule even if nobody acts in accordance with that rule. So if I went to explain the social rule, I might do it without basically resorting to habitual behavior at all, in principle. As for the other things, I agree completely with you, and that's what I wanted to ask. Even if we concede completely that an explanation of habits is or should be an integral part of the explanation of social rules, what's left to explain in terms of legal obligations that is not habitual in this empirical sense, or what is at least your kind of like, do you have a hunch what would play in an explanation of a legal obligation apart from an explanation of habitual?
Yeah, thank you.
Can I do a follow-up?
Yeah, all right.
Don't talk for 20 minutes
No,
and then.
no, because just to insert a question, what is your concept of choice? Because I think that one of the things that performs in your redefinition of habits is that at some point there is some choice involved that is not this mindless repetition.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned these microeconomics things, but then what is the concept of choice that is in the middle of your redefinition of habits that puts habits like farther away of this mindless repetition?
All right.
So I think that it
yeah,
goes
yeah.
within everything that was being asked.
Yeah, I mean, what's missing to understand legal obligation? Absolutely nothing. It's everything there.
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
obviously not. But so I guess I will. James is I think an extremely important author in this tradition of interpreting human habits, because he makes a very, and I think it's in pragmatism. Not sure, I think chapter 4. It's called Habits. It has the title Habits, and it's kind of ordinary language philosophy, because I mean, this is my way of reconstructing it. It's not exactly him, but I think that the point it makes is this. So when we talk about habits in our ordinary vocabulary, we cannot we cannot fail to make it ambiguous in many ways. So because we refer to two different things that cannot go together. One is habit as sort of a summary of past action. I have the habit of doing this or that, right? So you're not committing to anything in the future. You're not even committing to anything in the present. You're just recapitulating what you've done in the past. So habit here is a behavior. It's a summary of repeated behavior in the past. Other times, we use habit as a way of explaining choice. Or the lack of it, right? So why did you do that? I mean, this is so stupid, and you could have done that instead. I have the habit of doing this in this circumstance, and I just didn't think about it, right? So here, why, and what's important about James' observation is that it says the two don't go well together. In one case, habit is a behavior. In the other case, habit is a cause of your behavior. And of course, you can't use the same name for the two things. I mean, obviously you can, we do it all the times, but if you want to have a scientific understanding of the phenomenon, we have to distinguish it. So this is a redefinition. We can stick with habits, you know, and with ordinary language, kind of repetition, or we can stick with the ambiguity and say, yeah, we mean it in both ways, and in context we understand it. The point is to see that things are more complicated than that, and we can use something, an intuition behind the second way of referring to habit. Habit is something that skips intentional action, right, and explains choice as psychological mechanism that sort of overlaps your decision making to make it something a lot bigger. So I'm not saying obviously that you know, using your bathroom is, well, there are many social rules about that too, and you know, the fact that he complains about that and refers to perhaps not social in the sense of the whole society, but certainly rules between them, the way in which it is appropriate to act on the bathroom. So anyway, I don't want to get graphic, but the point is, he was referring to habit quite rightly as the behavior. I'm referring to habit in my redefinition as the psychological mechanism that explains that behavior. And the claim is that we can explain both that behavior as well as behavior in compliance with a social rule with the same psychological principles. It's obviously a different kind of behavior, but we can understand the difference through these conceptual elements of my redefinition. That's the claim I want to make. So one thing which is important to, I mean, this could, you know, we could take it from, you know, 100 different ways, but certainly in the pragmatist tradition, all this recognition of the importance of human habits to explain what we do goes with a dissatisfaction with the traditional Humean, but it's not Humean. Hume himself had, you know, such a sophistication in his understanding human behavior that, you know, but that there is a distinction between deliberate behavior, which is intentional, which forms, you know, cognitive objects in the mind of the agent and which is purposeful, and habitual behavior that it's not that, something that's completely opposite. Here, in this pragmatist tradition, one way of putting it would be that all behavior is habitual in the sense that we can explain all behavior through, you know, models or conception of human habits. Choice and reasoning choice is a very peculiar moment of the life of human agents when what we do is change habits. When we experience choice, it's a moment in which something blocks the habitual behavior, right? We find an obstacle. We can't go through. And then we have to decide, what are we going to do then? And our choice is a choice that reorganizes our pre-existing habits.
Even by continuing with the habit? Even by continuing with the habit. For example, Miodrag's wife. Miodrag can confront her about the spitting in the sink, and then she can say, she can say whatever, and then continue doing it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we have to distinguish between the empirics of it, which are obviously extremely complex and they require a psychological theory, which I don't have. There are many different ones, and the conceptual resources. So I don't know what to advise him. I mean, whether to change habits, that you gotta go and see her mind works. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it is a problem of human habits, definitely, I would think. Of course, this is a very extended definition of human habits. It's not the ordinary definition of human habits. You know, another way to think of it is this goes somewhat in the tradition of Celano and Brigaglia. They are very much interested in this social cognitive psychology revolution by people like Kahneman and Tversky and all that literature. And they distinguish between a system 1 and a system 2. System 1, it's fast, kind of stupid, not really reasoning. And system 2 is slow. System 1 is effortless, whereas system 2, you know, you have to put a lot of effort. Now, this is a huge literature, so, you know, it's not exactly like that. But certainly in terms of its genesis, part of its genesis in the Kahneman's tradition, this literature begins as a way of criticizing rational choice theory, which is system 2. Let us not forget, it's system 2, right? It doesn't work because we have, you know, laboratory experiments which show that, you know, the Bayesian super rational agent would behave differently than the students that we've recruited for the experiment in the case at hand. So we must explain that, and we see this deviation systematically, so we infer that this is system 1 that's operating beneath the conscious control of those super smart students who would have to be Bayesian, super Bayesians, but they're not. So in this scenario, we have, you know, utility functions with preferences, and so system 2 is the rational, system 1 is the irrational. What I want to do, system 2 is the utility maximizing super rational person. System 1 is the not so great maximizer. So to describe system 1, we have to do a lot of tricks to utility functions in order that they fit. So we have to assume time inconsistency of preferences. We need to assume lack of patience. We need to, which complicate the math incredibly. So my intuition would be, okay, let's try and flip it. System 1 is the maximizer. So we describe everything with system 1 as a super maximizer that fits the standard definition of utility maximization in microeconomics. System 2 is the guy who cannot maximize for some reason his existing preferences in the vocabulary of economists, habits in my vocabulary, and has to change their preferences. So it's the one who's completely unpredictable. I mean, it's very difficult to predict because, you know, is in a way choosing their utility function. It's not applying a utility function anymore. It's just choosing another one. Another one which depends on the one he had before and, you know, the non-depreciated effect of past choices. So, yeah, so I don't think I've answered, but it's, yeah, you see the intuition, though.
I see it.
I mean, of course, you know that this is all, I mean, it's a level of abstraction that, of just framing the question. Then I don't have any evidence that this works better than system 1 and system 2. it does work better in integrating them. If not in the paper, in other papers, I try to show that we can integrate not system 1 and system 2, but we can integrate sort of a more impulsive behavior within this definition of habits and see our behavior, day-to-day behavior, as habitual behavior, which is an outgrowth, which recruits impulses in a way which is learned and acquired. Anyways, that's the direction I'm going, but I don't want, just to finish so what's missing from legal obligation, I think the crucial step is to use this definition of habit to define secondary rules as well. Once we are there and have some hint of a model for that, then I think we are in a good position to go to legal obligation. I mean, this is just social rules. It's not particular of legal obligation. And the important point is, social rules, in my definition, are name of habits. So I can perfectly, accept the fact that there is a social rule, but nobody complies with it. It's just there is a name for something which is a habit that nobody has. That's the trick. I mean, it's a trick, but I think it kind of works. I mean, so you can be as the point is to have a reductionist understanding of social obligation, let's say. Why reductionist? Because it reduces social obligations to psychological, psychosocial variables, but which is not materialist, and it's not, most importantly, behaviorist. Why? Because I distinguish between the existence of a social rule, the existence of a name, and its effectivity.
But what I think more problematic is that what happens when you have a social rule within a community and everybody breaks the rule. So this is my yeah. So you know that there is a social rule. We are all breaking it. We are all breaking it, but we are aware of the existence of social rules. So basically, we have habitual behavior that goes against the social rule and are not in favor of the social rule. How would you say that there is a social? Why
we have a name? We have a name. We discussed it. We say, yeah, we perhaps we pay lip service to the fact that we are obligated to it, but it's not effective.
Okay, but still, then the habit doesn't play anything into the rule, into the definition of the rule in this case. It's just.
Well, I mean, it plays in the definition of the rule as something that a rule refers to, as a name. A rule is the name of a habit. More precisely, it's the name of the set of habits which reduce the relative marginal cost of cognitive awareness, motivational control. So that the same rule can be internalized by very different habits that we group together in a set, depending on their effects on the relative marginal cost of cognitive awareness and motivational control. So the same rule could be a compulsion or it could be a commitment. So, yeah, it's not exactly the name of a habit. Otherwise, I'd be committed to saying that a rule can only be a commitment or can only be a compulsion. I don't want to be committed to that. I want to be open to say that the same rule can be a compulsion for somebody and it can be a commitment for somebody else. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, yes.
I think he was. I'm not sure whether he was.
I'm so sorry. You were first.
Yeah. So,
I didn't see him.
on the slide, you mentioned to use some of the synonyms of habits which you mentioned: the abundance of impulses, skills, social capital, pleasure, or utility as simulation. So, sometimes habits are also informed by religion and traditions. So, did I miss this being part of the habits, or you did not want to include habits also being informed by religions and traditions?
Yeah, no, thank you. No. I definitely want to. I definitely want to include that, and I think so. I'm not an expert on the philosophy of religion, so I started, but I can, this is relevant for the context of discovery. I started getting really serious and into pragmatist philosophy by reading a small little book, which I always recommend as an intro to John Dewey, which is A Common Faith, I think. And he does wonders on his definition of religion and the religious experience of religious experience or the religious element in experience. And it's not really, it is a book on religion, but it's more a book which provides some basis of this model of human action. So there is a good answer, which I don't have, your question, which would connect very strongly the origins of, well, one sort of origins to this conception of habit, which is the Deweyan origin, to important points in the philosophy of religion. And I think Hans Joas, among contemporaries, is a sociologist, philosopher, very much into Dewey as well, and he is a philosopher of religion as well, and sociology of religion as well. So if you're interested in that side, you should look for Hans Joas. I don't want to exclude it, but I'm not sure whether I can include it. So, and that would go as to the sort of more empirical explanation of how particular habits are formed. Right? I'm committed in principle to the idea that you can describe a religious habits with those elements. I don't have an argument that can persuade you that I can, but yeah, I wouldn't. So it is definitely a relevant question. There is. So the tradition I'm referring to, particularly the pragmatist tradition, has a lot to say on that. I'm not an expert on that part of the pragmatist tradition, so I can only point you to other people who are really expert in that. I hope that I can explain, different sources of human habits, but that's not what I'm after right now. I mean, I think I have a sense that they can incorporate it. Why not? Of course, not from a metaphysical or divine source, but yeah.
Because sometimes habits have logic, and sometimes they are also illogical. And then if you look at the habits which are illogical, they are being informed by tradition, at least.
Yeah, I wouldn't go as. I mean, it is. Yeah, sometimes it is like that. Although, yeah, certainly some habits are thoughtless, definitely, and you can explain that, I think, with that model. You can describe them. Then it's a whole different matter. Saying that this is the right model for understanding all kind of human behavior. I mean, there is in principle a commitment to that claim. I can't defend it though. I mean, but thank you for your question.
Okay, I think that we have a last question.
Okay, so just so from my understanding, the Hume's concept of the habit is not an ontological but an epistemic notion, because it's I guess its purpose is to explain how we come about understanding and knowing causality, not necessarily what's at the center of it. There's a sentence in his treatise, I don't remember exactly, but where he actually said that we cannot come about and understand the invisible laws that govern causality, whatever. But again, through habit, we can understand it. So I guess when one hand, I would say that habit is a epistemic concept. On the other, the polemic we had about custom. Again, I just don't see how can one connect this to that, because for it we would need something else. For example, you mentioned that how James distinguishes two ways habit can be interpreted. One is behavior, and the other is motivation. But wouldn't motivation just be passion, as he calls, or will, or desire, and that's something else.
Yeah, not motivation, a cause of behavior.
Of course, yeah. Sorry,
Cause
what's the
of behavior.
But yeah.
So a psychological mechanism that causes overt behavior. Not the behavior itself, its cause.
Yes, I agree. And but then how can we come about and connect that notion with the just simple understanding of causality that would be happening?
I'm not sure I see the challenge specifically, but so the point is, yeah, I mean, you don't, I mean, you see something, you see the concept of habit is just too distant from the way we normally talk about social rules, and you say, how can we put the two together?
Just a team like that.
All right. So, well, I mean, the thing is, yeah, they're different concepts. We don't talk about habits when we talk about social rules. You don't see judges talking about habits, definitely. Thing is, to try and, I mean, this is the way I take it. So there is this bunch of, which is a very large literature in economics about habit formation and all of that. So one way to kind of explain what I'm trying to do is, all right, what do we need to use that to understand social rules, in particular social obligations, right? To describe, predict, and evaluate behavior which is in compliance with a social obligation. Now, Hart has three desiderata of any theory of social obligation that we need to distinguish between, the efficacy challenge, the compulsion challenge, and normativity challenge. If we solve them, if we meet those things, we can explain that there is a distinction between existence and efficacy of a social rule. We can point to behavior which is not just compulsive. We can give a non-implausible account of a rule's normativity. Then we are, we are very closer to using that theoretical vocabulary to explain social rules. If you have, then the game now is, all right, but still my intuitions don't align with anything you said. All right, try to pin them down though, right? So what is it that I can't explain using that model in order to account for social rules? What is it that I'm missing? One thing that I'm missing, perhaps, is the fact that, we understand behavior compliant with the social rules as behavior that stick with, repeating it, even if the behavior itself becomes super costly, right? And perhaps this definition of habit doesn't really incorporate this intuition. Is that something that explains?
If I understood you correctly, I guess we can observe different, I guess, facts, behaviors that, I guess, function on the presupposition that there is a connection between habit and the custom, but then again, we just cannot go, I guess, to the fullest length and actually explain the very causality itself. But I guess there is evidence to test the theory.
What do you mean causality itself?
No, maybe maybe I don't know what.
Ne.
No, I mean,
Esta você teve estudo aí.
Maybe I think we have like
Yeah.
25 minutes.
Totalmente.
Way past time, so you can continue discussing afterwards.
yeah, I'll be here next week.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much, Marco, for
Thank
this
you.
presentation. And thank you very much for the online attendance. See you in the next one.
Thank you.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah.